Chapter 23. As the golden sun played with the high cirrus clouds throughout the Toscan skies, Basil finally roused and opened his sleepy eyes. Feeling perfectly rested and refreshed, he sat up in the bedsheets and peered out at the expansive bedroom panorama, watching the deep blue ocean rolling gently.
Oh, paradise,
he sighed to himself, with curiosity getting the better of him. He climbed out of bed and strolled over to the windows to catch a better glimpse. It was here that he noted just how far the property's carved balcony extended out from the grand rotunda, nestled down into plush gardens full of fruit trees, rose hedges, and enormous flower beds that ran all the way to the shoreline. Out the corner of his eye, he caught movement under some gigantic banana palms beside the pool, and quickly realized it was Maud and his Uncle Sargon, slowly strolling toward a large stairway that took them back up onto the balcony. Basil swiftly wrapped a crisp, forest green tunic around his waist, and grabbing a slice of juicy pineapple, made a dash for the door. He scampered through the winding corridors, feeling the cool marble softly press against his bare feet until at last he arrived into the opulence of the grand rotunda, where he glimpsed Sargon and Maud both leaning over the balcony, facing the ocean and seemingly in deep conversation. Sensing Basil's presence, Sargon turned around.
Oh, why? You have finally joined us, dear nephew. What happened to you, mate?
Taunted Maud.
You slept for a century. Gee, I'm sorry I slept so long.
Basil scratched his head, slightly embarrassed.
Must have been that potion you gave me, Uncle. You needed it, son.
Sargon chuckled, patting Basil's back affectionately. Basil looked at Maud, who was gazing out into the great azure.
Did you eat breakfast? Did I eat breakfast?
Maud peered at Basil, the late afternoon sun catching his forehead.
Breakfast and lunch, mate.
Something within the way Maud glanced at Basil was different, and Basil noticed it immediately.
Oh, he knows,
Basil thought, having a small epiphany. He glanced at his uncle, and the subtle smile peering through his bearded lips said it all.
Maud and I have had many hours to converse about current matters over breakfast and lunch,
Sargon said quite frankly.
Okay.
Basil nodded, slightly anxious.
I have briefly shared with Maud what I explained to you last night,
Sargon informed quietly. Basil glanced at Maud empathetically and put a hand on his shoulder. He did not want his friend to be burdened with all his baggage as well.
Maud is like a brother to you, son,
Sargon spoke calmly, giving Basil a lowly gaze.
Brothers share the joys and sorrows of life. They surpass the ages together, and they would die for one another, remaining loyal unto their blood wets the sands of the underworld, above all else.
Sargon slowly stepped beside a long cloisonné coffee table and gestured for Basil and Maud to sit opposite him on the surrounding ottomans and lounge chairs. No sooner after they sat, Sargon's beloved wife Evelyn came with Alden, carrying wooden trays full of juiced beverages and platters of exotic fruits, fresh seafood, and soapstone pots full of sahlab, a sweet Middle Eastern pudding. She glanced gently at Sargon and then at Basil and Maud, gleaming her radiant smile that would warm the coldest heart for 1,000 years. Spoke Sargon in foreign tongue, kissing her as she returned inside. Basil and Maud glared inquisitively at Sargon.
Can I ask you what language is that?
Wondered Basil. Sargon smiled.
It is a mix of Akkadian, a very ancient language, from the times of Mesopotamia here on Earth, as well as Mayoran. And you know where that comes from.
He sipped on a fresh glass of pomegranate juice and glanced at the two of them, taking some flatbread from the platters.
Maud and I have had a nice time together today. It is important that Maud knows what is going on, and indeed he does so now. I've never had a better friend than you, Baz.
Maud nodded, turning to Basil.
Whoever you are, whatever you are, doesn't change a thing between me and you. I've got your back, mate.
Basil felt himself swell at Maud's heartfelt words and put an arm over his shoulder.
And I too, mate. God knows where I'd be without you. And this, my sons, is the unbreakable spirit of true friendship.
Sargon immediately clapped his hands together, moved by the admirable affection.
Bound by no condition, no prerequisites, just unconditional love and unconditional loyalty. And remember, respect is all there is. Never forget that.
Sargon then gazed over his shoulder to the far northeast.
Do you know what that is over there?
He pointed, and the two of them followed his line of sight to a circular building, striking no less, with a domed roof, rimmed with full-length glass windows, reflecting the stark golden rays of the low afternoon sun. It sat upon a chunk of land that had broken away from the mainland, and a frightfully high bridge that soared through the skies connected it to what appeared to be Sargon's study, way off in the distance.
Is that bridge attached to your study, Uncle?
Basil asked, still looking.
Yes, it is, son. I have no idea what that place could be.
Basil answered, glancing at Sargon.
What is it? That is my observatory.
Smiled Sargon.
I have some things I want to show you there tonight. I love nothing more than to explore the beauty of deep space from the confines of my home. Inside is an 88-inch reflector telescope. Rest assured, you can touch the stars through its lenses. Oh, I've always wanted to visit the moon.
Maud enthused.
Well, through this telescope, should an ant be on the lunar surface, we would see it.
Sargon nodded.
We will have light refreshments now, but save some room for later, for there will be a midnight feast. We have some very special guests coming.
Basil's heart fluttered.
Surely not Ira?
He thought to himself. Sargon read his thoughts quickly.
Unfortunately not Ira tonight, son. Ha! Ha ha ha! And you think I'm onto women too much?
Maud laughed, poking his finger into Basil's face.
Truly, mate, you're worse than me. Ha 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 ha.
Sargon chuckled, fondly remembering the stirring emotions that are all too obvious in young men.
So, who are these special guests, Uncle?
Basil questioned. Uncle Sargon pressed his smirking lips together.
Why, I do not wish to spoil the surprise,
He conceded.
but I ask if you would so kindly dress in the attire presented in your sleeping quarters when you return to Bay. I would most appreciate it. Our guests command our finest manners.
Now this got Basil excited. He wondered who on earth could it be coming?
And so, why at midnight?
Queried Maud, feeling just as intrigued as Basil.
It is the quintessential arrival time of our beloved guests.
Explained Sargon, popping an olive into his mouth.
Very much an old Mayoran custom to feast at midnight. One we cherish in this family. We talk, we drink, and we eat our merry selves all through the night, relaxing under the shimmering cosmos. Oh, well, just so you know, I have no problem staying awake all night.
Offered Maud eagerly.
Oh, yes.
Basil rolled his eyes mockingly.
Now, don't we all know that?
Sargon took another olive from the platter.
Please,
He gestured with his hand.
eat with me now.
Maud, never one to say no to food, took a strange-looking cracker and swiped it through the creamy hummus. He closed his eyes, moaning with pleasure.
Amazing. Eat, eat!
Sargon adamantly glared at Basil, gently thrusting a platter full of odd-looking crustaceans, resting on a bed of steaming rice toward him.
Thank you, Uncle.
Basil chuckled, helping himself. He was ravenous.
I'm looking around.
Maud said, appearing perplexed.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Uncle Sargon, but I don't see Sydney anymore. There's not a house or a city in sight.
Sargon appeared amused.
Did you, by any chance, feel disorientated or experience a sudden jolt of pain in your neck within that underground tunnel?
Basil and Maud eyed each other. They remembered the distinct pain that crippled them both to their knees after the fright of their life.
Yes, we did, Uncle.
Answered Basil with surprise.
Both at the same time, funnily enough. Well, the moment you felt the pain,
Sargon said, sipping some mango juice.
You actually hit the barrier of a small interdimensional portal, and subsequently, the two of you teleported some 1900 miles north of Sydney in not even a fraction of a second. Teleport?
Basil said, flabbergasted.
You mean we just disappeared from one place and turned up at another? Yes,
replied Sargon.
Relatively speaking. Indeed, you are now in a very secluded location in far northern Australia, in the tropics. Here we are surrounded amongst wild beauty, untouched nature and abundance. Blessed, I say. I have to admit, I've never seen a home quite like this one before,
Maud remarked.
I mean, I don't want to be rude, but it must have cost £1 million. Where did you find the money for it? What do you do for work? I mean, 'cause you're clearly not in jail.
Basil shot Maud a condescending glance, for he knew it was not polite to ask anyone about their private finances. Sargon smiled warmly at Maud's prying innocence.
Well, it was a lot simpler than you think.
He explained.
It cost nothing.
Maud gasped.
Inherited then?
Sargon chuckled heartily. Now he even had Basil's unwavering attention.
As you are now both well aware, Maoran people are highly advanced in their evolutionary journey, and we have perfected certain abilities for manipulating the field. The field?
Basil frowned. Sargon nodded.
The field is...
he began, looking up into the aqua sky.
The field is similar to oxygen. You know it is there, but one cannot see it. The field is a substance that you could call God's breath. It is in every single fragment within existence. It holds a resonant frequency and even has a tone, yet it is invisible. We Majorans have mastered the skill of manipulating this field, and therefore we can manifest anything our hearts desire. My home Alioth is a result of my thoughts manipulated and broken down into the finest of details. These foods before you are manifested because of my thoughts. That's unbelievable,
cried Maud.
You can conjure up anything? How do you do that? Let me add that I am not the exception, for you both can do it too. Anyone can do it.
Sargon spoke.
However, I will say that it does take a great level of mental discipline to achieve it, and it also comes with responsibility. And how do you learn mental discipline?
Basil asked with intrigue.
We of Majora owe these great skills to the mastery of the Ata. I see,
murmured Basil, now very curious about this Ata. At that very moment, Sargon placed his thumb and index finger over his mango juice, as if he wanted to pinch it. What happened next astounded Basil and Maud. As Sargon lifted his fingers in his pinching position, the mango juice was pulled up out of the glass, as if it had become like glue.
Oh, gosh!
Maud shrieked, thrusting himself back onto the sofa. Basil's jaw dropped. He could not say anything. Sargon studied their reactions very carefully. He then placed his focus back on the mango juice.
The physics behind this is really very simple,
He said, finally pulling his finger and thumb apart, and the mango juice immediately splashed back into the glass.
Ha ha ha! It's like magic! Maud laughed. I don't bloody believe it! The esoteric practice you call magic is real.
Sargon explained.
On a rudimentary level, it is basically an advanced science, based on the law of physics. But like most things in this day and age, it is indeed a lost science, and severely misunderstood.
He let out a pitiful sigh.
Everything you have been taught in your society is lies. What is presented as fantasy or unreal in your reality is actually more real than you think. So why are we taught this then?
Basil asked.
I mean, if it's all fake and unreal. Because acquiring the truth is knowledge, and knowledge is the real power in the world. Hindering the human population with lies and deceit keeps them guessing and distracted.
Basil and Maud eagerly waited for Sargon to continue. He became very withdrawn and stared into the various food platters, contemplating his thoughts.
I have seen many cultures, peoples, and empires rise and fall in my time.
Sargon murmured, returning his attention to their fascinated glances.
What you do not know is that I am a Sumerian king, father of the dynasty of Akkad, ruling the Akkadian Empire over 4,000 years ago. But my beginnings were very unprivileged.
Basil and Maud immediately glared at each other, stunned.
So,
Maud stuttered, frowning hard at Sargon.
so, you're saying you're like a real king?
His voice almost hushed to a whisper.
Like our King George?
Sargon smiled modestly.
I feel like I need to drop to one knee.
Maud glared back at Basil.
How could you know such things as this?
Sargon quickly insisted.
Naturally, it is not common knowledge. I'm shocked, Uncle.
Basil whispered, eyes wide.
That was the one thing you didn't mention last night. You had enough to digest last night.
Sargon sighed deeply.
And believe me, it was not always like this.
Sargon sat back comfortably on his chair.
I was born an orphan child. My father, Liatal, a son of Myora, briefly visited Earth on a Passover mission to the star Alpha Centauri. My Earth mother, Intana, was a peasant and lived with her family along the beautiful Euphrates River on the outskirts of Babylon. My mother's family was poor and her mother plagued by ill health, unable to work. So, the obligation was handed to my mother, and she was sent to work in the central bazaar of East Quarter. Her days at the bazaar were long and tiresome. She was grossly underpaid and never at all treated well by her boss.
A small smile appeared over Sargon's lips.
Then one day, It just so happened that after the vernal equinox, an impeccably dressed, stunning woman of unmatched radiance walked through that bazaar and took my mother's breath away. Never had my mother recalled such a statuesque beauty. The finest silks she wore, her scent of frankincense and Nineveh rose, the mountains of gold delicately woven through her long wavy hair, black as night. This mysterious woman caught my mother's passing glance, and out of intrigue befriended my mother. Perhaps it was out of pity, or perhaps she admired my mother's naivety. Either way, the woman offered her a better life, should she wish it. My mother soon learned that the woman, Vanna, was a high priestess of the Kukumi temple, run by the priests of Anu in North Quarter. My mother could not believe her good fortune, but later she learned the solemn truth of Vanna. Vanna was, in reality, a concubine of the Anu priests, and there was nothing godly about what she did, nor the temple sex rites she, as well as the other concubines, had to perform with these Anu priests. And bed many of them they did, not to mention the many affluent men and women that hailed from far and wide across the vast lands. Oh, but the plunder, the riches these corrupted priests acquired, made them the wealthiest and most powerful citizens of Babylon, besides the king himself, of course.
Sargon peered out over the blue horizon.
My beloved mother's heart was tender, gentle, and she was undecided whether she had the strength within her to be doing such things. But the options left in her favor were all but woeful, and so she too became a concubine of the Kukumi temple. Vanna taught her all that she needed to know, and soon enough my mother emulated Vanna in appearance, in stature, in manner, and in everything she did. She became one of those desirable women strolling through the central bazaar of East Quarter, and provided more than enough mina and silver for her family, and offered her mother the proper medical care she needed. 12 moon cycles after her new life as a concubine, 3 peculiar men slowly strolled through the gardens of the temple late one sultry night. They entered, their long flowing cloaks fluttering within the balmy night winds. Distinctly authoritative and regal they were, yet pleasant and warm in manner, and not one soul within those alabaster walls of the temple had ever before witnessed such striking men. The gardeners, the servants, they stood and watched in awe as they passed, lost for words, even the priests themselves, for they had never seen such men in their midst. As the 3 of them gallantly climbed a large terrace to inside the temple, there my mother first laid eyes on those fascinating visitors. She was immediately taken by the middle one, his dark flowing hair, his haunting eyes befalling upon her, slicing her heart like a Galvan sword. Indeed, it was my father Lyatal. But unbeknownst to my mother, my father had long before planned this imminent encounter. And as she led him up those winding stairs to the top floor, the best chambers reserved for only the most distinguished guests, his incredible presence engulfed her. She noted the oddness of him, his aroma, the finely woven fabric of his clothing, which seemed to glisten, yet there were no seams, the foreign symbols on his golden cloak clasps, and most of all, those dark, evocative eyes that seemed to penetrate the deepest parts of her soul. He lay her down within his arms and made love to her like no man before or after, stretching her ecstasy beyond the bounds of normalcy itself. And she knew she would never be the same. Her cries of pleasure echoed throughout the high night winds, across the lands far and wide on that fated night. "Who are you?" she asked, unable to resist, to which he replied, "A man of the stars." And for a swift moment, my mother thought of it as a metaphor, his words.
Sargon chuckled.
But she realized, through the depth of his eyes and the strong sense of love that he shared, that he meant quite literally.
Basil and Maud sat dazzled, fully involved with the story Sargon imparted to them.
"I would love to meet your father,"
Basil muttered with an amused smirk.
"He's a force to be reckoned with." "Ha ha 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 ha. Sons of Maora are known for their unforgettable romantic interludes."
Sargon laughed with a glint in his eye.
"We are known to many throughout the cosmos as Bahu Vavanahan. And that means
Maud raised an eyebrow.
sons of heart shatter." "And the women of Maora?"
Basil asked curiously. Sargon gave Basil a suggestive wink.
"You know all too well, my dear nephew."
Came the words flooding through Basil's mind. Sargon lowered his gaze and hit him with a wave of love that gave his heart pins and needles.
"Oh,"
Basil groaned, clutching at his chest.
"I felt that." "Good.
Sargon nodded in earnest.
So, if I may continue on, it was on this auspicious night that my father, the great deep space explorer, Lyatal, planted the Maoran seed within my young mother in Tana's womb. And such a turbulent and uncomfortable pregnancy she endured, that midway through her gestation, she could no longer provide service at the Kukumi temple. The high vibratory field of my father's Maoran energy caused a heartstorm within her." "I bet it did."
Maud snickered, popping another grape in his mouth.
"And therefore, after gifting her with an encounter of a lifetime, my father was gone, vanished.
Sargon murmured.
The lords of the stars who walked in had touched those women they befriended for an eternity thereafter. And from then onward, my dear mother found herself looking for my father's mysterious face everywhere she went, dreaming of seeing him walk through those arching marble columns of the temple. Every man she bedded, she hoped, praying to Inanna that she would cross his path just one last time. But she never did see him again. Many a time she wondered if her encounter was all but a dream, and that she was impregnated by another. But then she would feel and rub her fatting belly, and she knew it was real. She could feel his potency within her.
Silence fell over Sargon for a brief moment, and Basil and Maud sat quietly, waiting for the words to roll off his tongue once more. They noticed his expression change to one of stoic nostalgia.
My mother died giving birth to me along the banks of the beloved Euphrates River.
He exhaled sharply.
When she knew she was losing too much blood, she panicked, placing me in a basket of rushes, pushing me away from the bank and praying that someone would find me floating along the river and take pity on my soul. My father had long returned to my aura, for he knew what was to come.
Why did your father not help your mother?
Asked Basil, concerned. Sargon turned his gaze to Basil.
You will understand one day the delicate balance of life and death, mortality and immortality. They slip through each other unceasingly. It was her destiny. It was her role to play in the grand scheme of things.
Sargon explained.
But of course it does not fill the void that so troubles our hearts.
Basil and Maud nodded in agreement. A smile formed across Sargon's lips, revealing those glorious dimples.
My earliest memories were sleeping beside the river, my toes being nibbled on by rats, and stealing bread from the central bazaar.
Ha! Rats!
Basil scoffed.
Now I've had my fair share of rats at East Docks, but never nibbled on, thank goodness.
I learned later in my life that a sympathetic man had found me washed up on the bank in my basket. His good name was Akiki, and Akiki took me in and raised me as his own. And as a young boy, I worked in his gardens until he died of failing health when I was 5 years old. Then I really learned what survival was. I had to fend for myself, and it was not before long that I found myself always in trouble, but too cunning to get caught. Until one night, in my late teens, along with several other of my bandit friends, we were bold enough to jump the high walls of the great King Urzababa's palace. He who reigned over all the lands as far as the eye could see. The Kish king had a grand palace in North Quarter, and rumor was that he had a spectacular chamber laden with blocks and blocks of gold.
Sargon's eyes widened.
Indeed, this was proven to be true, as my assailants and I found the decadent chamber. We thought we were the luckiest men on earth, yet alas, we were not so fortuitous in our plan of escape. We were seized by palace guards, and on the succeeding sunset, the old and pious King Urzababa ordered us to our deaths by way of the sword to our throats, in honor of the most radiant goddess Inanna. But, unbeknownst to me and my bandit friends laying behind rat-infested iron bars and cuffed to a wall, bloodied with chains and shackles, King Urzababa was in the midst of a very disturbing dream of being visited by the goddess Inanna herself. The words she spoke to the king in his slumber were as follows. If you, wise king, allow the captured one Sargon to live, you shall rejoice in great power and fortune, and live out your years peacefully. If you shall choose to take his life, you will lose all power and plunder, and die a feeble and poorly man, with your reign overthrown. Naturally, the great king was extremely flustered by the dream, and deeply frightened by the divine yet austere encounter. He sought to hit himself, to personally come down to the prison chambers, in the middle of the night, to see who indeed was this young thief Sargon.
Sargon erupted into great laughter, remembering the memory, as if it happened yesterday.
Yeah, that's what I call lucky,
Chuckled Basil. Sargon nodded, but he knew that it was more than luck on his side.
It was undoubtedly an auspicious moment for me also. We all thought we were dreaming, when we glimpsed the old king entering, adorned in his auroch skins and linen nightrobe woven with gold. He ordered the guards to unshackle all of us immediately, sending my accomplices on their way. but keeping me behind. I have to admit to my terror, but to my utter surprise, I was chaperoned to the bathing chambers, only to be then fitted in beautiful silks from the Orient and the best cottons from Cairo. Finally, I was seated in a lavish dining hall overlooking the Euphrates, dining with the old king in those early morning hours, where sumptuous platters of freshly caught salmon and lobster were all laid out, fatted lamb, flavored breads and rice, and the finest beer and wines of the East.
Basil Lamond sat transfixed, listening intently.
Now, one must remember that I had lived a very meager existence up until that very moment. For a poor and decrepit young man such as I, this experience was implausibly overwhelming. One moment I was an orphan stealing a king's loot, and then the next I was dining at his table.
Sargon shook his head.
What was going through your mind?
Asked Maud quietly.
As you both know by now, life works in many mysterious ways.
Sargon glanced out at the purple sea, the wind playing with his curled beard.
I had not the slightest idea what was unfolding. I was convinced I was hallucinating. I thought perhaps I had died behind those filthy prison bars.
He shrugged.
But it became clear to me that I was still alive, and yes, this, indeed, was all real. The trembling King Erzababa was rattled to his core, but very direct with me from the moment I sat with him. He asked me if I was a pious young man, to which I answered that I was, and that I gave great glory to the goddess Inanna. He was pleased.
I've never heard of this goddess Inanna,
murmured Basil.
A true goddess, worshipped by the Mesopotamian people.
Sargon explained.
And so the great King Erzababa informed me that he had woken from his treacherous slumber and was approached by the goddess herself to spare my life. He too learned that I was an orphan and that I had taken care of myself from the moment of Akiki's death. King Erzababa became enthralled by my history and eventually honored me as the son he never had. He had 11 daughters, and thus took the dream as an opportune sign from the goddess and honored it as such. And from that night onward, I lived within the walls of his grand palace, and he taught me how to read and write, how to use the Gelelvan sword, combat, to think like a man, how to be just, and acquire temperance and valor. But most of all, he taught me how to earn respect. It was 2 years later, the night before I was due to fight my first battle on the front line, and the capture of Uruk, that I too was visited by the goddess Inanna herself. We sat on the terrace of my sleeping quarters, admiring the glint of the full moon dancing on the tranquil Euphrates. It was then she told me I had been groomed since I was a child to become king, and that it was my foreseen destiny upon planet Earth. You mean it was your destiny to be an orphan also?
Wondered Maud naively.
Yes, of course.
Smiled Sargon.
Being without the bare necessities teaches a man many great virtues. Humility for one, among many others. Inanna mentioned to me that although she was known as a goddess on planet Earth, her real identity was that of an elder from the Ishtar people, an advanced race of peoples living on a planet near the star Aldebaran, located in the Taurus constellation. That memorable night she advised me that I was also from the stars, and she shared with me the history of my parents and how my father belonged to the Mayoran race, allies of the Ishtar.
Sargon gazed upon the dimming blue sky as it morphed into hues of violet.
I had lived 18 Earth years at the time, and Inanna's prophetic visions were correct. Under my command, the king's army captured the walls of Uruk. A fierce and bloody battle it was, yes, but we rejoiced. King Erzababa was deeply humbled. His love for me grew deeper, and I was honored to serve under his rule. He gave me full command of his entire army, and we became victorious in many more battles over the succeeding years.
Sargon turned and glanced at Basil-Amod.
King Erzababa died peacefully when I was 26 Earth years of age. He bequeathed all his power to me, for which I then became King Sargon of Akkad.
Sargon tore at some flatbread and wiped it through the hummus, quickly throwing it into his mouth. He grinned through his bites.
Did the goddess Inanna visit you any more through your life?
Basil wondered.
Only once more,
Whispered Sargon, touched by her memory.
On her second and final visit, she told me that I would be traveling to faraway lands to learn the Atah.
Sargon had a look of deep contemplation as he glanced toward the ocean horizon. He inhaled the warm, salty air deeply.
And so you went?
Basil glared at him.
I did.
Sargon muttered quietly.
The Maora civilization is part of a large galactic confederation. Those of us in the confederation all know of the Atah. The Atah is an archetypal component of the cosmic order.
So it's compulsory to know it then?
Basil assumed carefully.
It is not compulsory, but if you want to evolve and to become fit to exist within the great cosmos, then it is for your own benefit.
Sargon glanced at Basil.
I learned the Atah in my 40s, and after, under my rule, I acquired large parts of Mesopotamia, much more than what is speculated in history. Of the land masses you young men know of modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Iran. My beautiful palace was built upon the foundations of King Erzababa's, before the rise of the new one that Hammurabi built. One beautiful moonlit night, while sleeping beside my Eberlin, tucked away in my quarters, overlooking the hanging gardens, I was stabbed in the heart with a fine long sword. The clever bandit was paid off by a soured Zagros ally of mine, known as Butros. Unluckily for Butros and the bandit, they were both bludgeoned to death by my palace guards before brought to justice.
How could the bandit be so clever as to get into your palace?
Basil frowned, his face lit up by the various garden lamps.
Imagine, he treaded the water of the Euphrates for 5 hours, hiding amongst the mosquito-infested reeds, waiting for the guard changeover to take his chance at climbing the palace walls.
Sargon reached for his drink.
I had a prosperous life back in those days, but it went hand in hand with a life of battle and hardship, and although I had many an ally, I had also accumulated enemies. Foxes wearing sheepskins, I believe the saying goes. The attitude outside the walls of Babylon was barbaric and tribal, and after a reign of more than 70 long earth years, I was buried under the sands beside King Erzababa. But what my great Mesopotamian people of Akkad did not know was that my blood was Maoran. I was murdered, yes, but thanks to the disciplines of the Atah that I had acquired by the age of 96, I could heal myself by regenerating my cells and rise from the dead. I did not look a day past 40 years old, at the ripe old age of 96.
Resurrected from the dead?
Maud asked, his mouth agape.
Yes,
Sargon answered quietly.
it is more common than you think. My beloved Evelyn, also of my own blood, knew this regenerative process, and thus patiently waited for the healing to take its course. Once fully recovered 42 days later, oxygen flooded back into my lungs, like a dam bursting its banks. I opened my own sarcophagus, and on the bewitching hour, quietly snuck back into Babylon to my palace, and stirred my Evelyn, who was sleeping in our quarters. Moments later, we were silently plucked out of the darkness by my beloved father Liator, along with other fellow Maoran brothers, and taken back home to Maora for a time.
Basil's thoughts were racing.
So, if you stayed in Babylon and your people saw you alive again,
He calculated.
then they would have thought you as a living god.
Sargon interjected, finishing the sentence.
And of course we did not want that to unfold. All of this happened thousands of years ago. And to look at these monumental places now, you would see nothing but ruins and dust and sand flies. But as I have said, there is more than what meets the eye always. And just as you went through the portal in that tunnel, so too are there natural portals, positioned all over this earth in specific areas. That specific area in Iraq has a slip in dimensional congruency, and if one is not careful, they will slip into the rich worlds of old Babylon.
So you're saying that Babylon still exists?
Questioned Basil.
Everything exists,
Sargon answered.
all at once, past, present, and future. They do not go anywhere. Time has created linear separation, but in reality, there is no separation.
I don't get it.
Basil frowned. Sargon grabbed a large fuchsia pomegranate from the platter and tore it open with his hands. A flurry of pink little seeds spilled everywhere.
If you look carefully, nature reveals the secrets of the universe.
He murmured, eyeing Basil and Maud.
Go on, tell me, what do you see?
Basil and Maud laughed and bashfully shrugged at each other.
I see pink seeds, skin.
Basil answered awkwardly.
Well, without being cheeky, Sargon, I'm seeing a big bloody mess.
Chuckled Maud.
Yes. What you have both observed is true.
Sargon laughed.
Clearly you are stating the obvious. But there is more than that. Do you not see what I see?
They shook their heads.
Wisdom, creation, the language of the universe.
Sargon whispered, staring at the pink seeds, mesmerized.
Each one of these seeds exists at the same time. All around each other, behind each other, and in front of each other. They are all equally independent and unique, yet they are all connected to the same skin, and exist together simultaneously, a part of the whole. This is the same with the nature of reality. There are many individual realities, but each exists together, past, present, and future.
Okay, well that makes better sense.
Nodded Basil.
You have a great way of explaining things, Uncle.
So why did you come back to Earth?
Maud wondered curiously.
Earth is known as a precious jewel among the cosmos.
Spoke Sargon passionately.
There are many beautiful places in our universe, and Earth is equally as beautiful. Many civilizations are evolved, yes, but sometimes their home planet lacks the bare elements for living, such as water. And yet Earth has it all. Water, mountains, deserts, blue skies, not to mention metals and gases. This is, without a doubt, a very unique and diversified planet.
Sargon stretched out his arms wide.
Just look at our surroundings, gentlemen. Need I say more?
This is paradise.
Agreed Basil.
This is one reason why many civilizations love visiting planet Earth, simply because of its biodiversity. Another reason why I came back here is because I serve on the High Council of Myora as Earth's ambassador, and it is my duty to keep an eye on the Myoran souls living upon this planet.
He explained.
And I am honored to serve my people as such.
Basil had a desire to ask his uncle about his tattoos all over his back.
Uncle, I wanted to ask you something, if you don't feel it too personal.
You can ask me anything your heart desires, son.
Sargon reassured, already knowing what Basil had in mind.
Well, what is it with all those markings and tattoos all over your back?
These are my titles. Initiation marking, and markings noting something significant in my life. It is my history, my story. It is a custom of the Myoran man, but not a compulsory habit. It is a long tradition, as it honors the old ways of our people.
And you have so many,
stammered Basil.
Well, yes, I do, but you do remember my age, do you not?
Yes, you have lived many years, so I shouldn't act so surprised.
Perhaps you will acquire your own one day,
enthused Sargon. He glanced at Maud.
And maybe you too. You do not have to be Myoran to be marked. Don't you think me mama would be liking that too much?
Maud laughed.
Whatever pleases your fancy.
The sun had disappeared by now, and the night skies had befallen.
Oh, my esteemed guests.
Sargon stood to his feet.
Twilight is upon us, and time is of the essence of this evening. I ask that you now relax, bathe, and prepare yourselves for tonight's grand feast. I will see you at 11.
As Basil and Maud stood to their feet, Alden swiftly arrived, ready to escort them back to their quarters.
How does he always come at the right time?
Wondered Basil. Sargon tapped in between his brows.
Of course!
Basil giggled sheepishly.
I've got to get used to this other ways of communication.
Sargon bowed low as the two of them left his company and watched them disappear from view. Back inside the comforts of their sleeping quarters, Maud staggered toward Basil.
Your uncle has blown me away, like literally, mate.
He shrieked.
Why didn't you say anything about all this last night?
Basil gave him a hard look.
Oh, come on, Maud. I saw how you reacted to all this weird stuff with the medallion. And the stuff with Ira. How the hell would I begin to tell you about last night? That I'm this supposed keeper with this incredible extraterrestrial bloodline, eh? I would have thought you was drunk or totally queer. Or both.
Scoffed Maud.
Yeah, my point exactly.
But your uncle, my God, I've never met a man like him.
Maud flopped onto Basil's freshly pulled down bed blankets.
And him pulling out that bloody mango juice. What the hell was that?
Trust me, mate.
Basil turned to him.
It feels just as nuts to me too.
He sat in front of the table that was covered in a beautiful smorgasbord of delicious food.
Take a look at that.
Basil flicked his head to the dresser, munching on a handful of Sukari dates. There was a neat array of clothing hanging from a wooden clothes rack.
Is that what we're wearing tonight?
Maud rolled onto his side, sizing up the attractive clothing.
Well, that's what I'm wearing.
Basil reassured, admiring the delicately woven, navy floor-length caftan with its long sleeves and high V-neck collar.
It must be all handmade. You would never find that on High Street, or even at the tailor's. I mean, look at that braided belt, and that black robe with the gold tassels. Oh, it's an outfit.
Agreed Maud.
You would look like a king of Babylon yourself. And a handsome one, of course.
Winked Basil.
You mustn't be so bold with your tongue. We haven't seen mine yet.
Maud leaped from Basil's bed and ran up the stairs to his quarters. Shoving a date in his mouth, Basil dashed after him, for he didn't want to miss this either.